Greetings, mortal. In the grand tradition of medieval epics, where valiant knights quested across plague-ridden landscapes in search of glory, one might expect a certain dignity to proceedings. Alas, 1348 Ex Voto, the third-person action-adventure from the plucky 15-person Italian outfit Sedleo, has instead delivered something rather more akin to a village idiot tumbling into the moat while waving a rainbow banner. Released on March 12, 2026 for PlayStation 5 and PC, this cinematic tale of chivalric derring-do has, in the span of a mere fortnight, managed to unite the internet's warring tribes in a rare moment of consensus. The game is not terribly good. Yet consensus, in these fractious times, is a fragile thing, and the ensuing furore has proven far more entertaining than the sword swinging itself. Set against the tumultuous backdrop of 14th century Italy, that golden age of political intrigue, rural exodus, and, one gathers, the occasional bout of pestilence, the player assumes the role of Ida, a young noblewoman turned knight-errant. Her mission, should she choose to accept it, and the game rather insists she does, is to track down her closest companion, Bianca, following a brutal raid on their hometown. Voice work from the likes of Albie Baldwin and Jennifer English lends a veneer of polish, while the visuals do a passable impression of atmospheric medieval squalor. Bandits lurk, mercenaries swagger, religious zealots pontificate, and the countryside festers in a manner that would make Boccaccio nod approvingly. On paper, it evokes the spirit of those classic chivalric romances, a linear quest, satisfying longsword combat, and a narrative focused on personal stakes rather than epic sprawl. In practice, one suspects the parchment was nibbled by moths. The trouble, dear listener, began well before launch. A public demo had already set tongues wagging, or rather, keyboards clacking, over the game's woke credentials. A female protagonist in armor? Perish the thought. A close female bond that, whisper it, edges towards something rather more than sisterly. Heavens above. The anti-woke brigade, ever vigilant for the slightest whiff of agenda, descended like locusts upon the Steam forums. Here was proof positive, they thundered, that modern gaming had abandoned fun in favor of lectures. Protagonist designs were deemed insufficiently fetching, the romance subplot suspiciously tender, and the entire affair a calculated slight against the noble tradition of chainmail-clad heroes who knew their place in the gender hierarchy. One almost admires the dedication. It takes a special sort of zeal to review bomb a game months before it exists. Yet irony, that most British of virtues, was not long in arriving. Upon release, the very outlets one might expect to champion such fare found themselves mildly underwhelmed by the lesbian content. Short on lesbians, declared one wag in the gaming press, as though the developers had promised a sapphic spectacular and delivered instead a polite handshake. The romance, it transpired, was light on explicitness, more subtext than spectacle, leaving both camps faintly disappointed, the traditionalists because it existed at all, the progressives because it didn't go far enough. In the annals of culture war absurdities, this ranks rather highly, a game accused simultaneously of being too gay and not gay enough. One pictures the developers scratching their heads, wondering whether to issue an apology or a pride flag. Matters escalated when enterprising sleuths unearthed the game's financial underpinnings. Sedleo, it emerged, had availed itself of roughly €600,000 in tax credits and grants from the Italian Ministry of Culture's video games tax relief program between 2021 and 2024. Cue the predictable howls. Italian taxpayers, it was claimed, had unwittingly bankrolled LGBTQ+ propaganda dressed up in medieval drag. Social media erupted with memes of plague doctors brandishing rainbow lances and earnest threads decrying the misuse of public funds. Never mind that the sum, while not trivial for a small studio, pales beside the average Hollywood blockbuster budget. Never mind that tax relief schemes exist precisely to nurture creative industries in economically challenged times. The narrative was set. Here was a government-sponsored assault on traditional values, complete with long swords and lingering glances. The developers, for their part, had not helped their cause pre-launch. Social media missives were interpreted, fairly or otherwise, as dismissive of critics who preferred their medieval fare unadorned by contemporary sensibilities. A retweet here, a pointed remark there, and suddenly the studio found itself painted as sneering at the very audience it hoped to court. Forums were moderated with the enthusiasm of a particularly officious town crier, deleting threads deemed unhelpful. In the event, this proved counterproductive. Nothing swells a review bombing campaign quite like the suspicion of censorship. By launch day, the die was cast. Technical woes only compounded the farce. PC performance, by all accounts, left something to be desired, frame rates dipping like a poorly maintained trebuchet, crashes interrupting dramatic monologues, and at least one reported instance of save files vanishing upon viewing the credits, as though the game itself wished to erase evidence of its existence. Combat, billed as satisfying and inspired by genre classics, emerged rather more rote, swing, parry, repeat, with occasional bouts of frustration born of finicky hit detection. The 6 to 8 hour runtime, while admirably concise for an indie title, felt less like elegant brevity and more like an admission that the barrel had been scraped. Environments were handsome enough, granted, but linear corridors and fetch quests do not a memorable odyssey make. Critics, on balance, awarded middling scores, a Metacritic aggregate hovering around 54, praising the premise while lamenting execution. Steam users, meanwhile, delivered a verdict rather closer to the stocks, mixed at best, with the percentage of positive reviews scraping the low 50s amid a deluge of one-star salvos. Peak concurrent players on Steam barely nudged past 400, a figure that speaks volumes for a title that had, at one point, amassed an impressive wishlist. Sales figures remain the studio's secret, but the optics are hardly stellar for a multi-year endeavor featuring established voice talent. The Xbox Series version, quietly axed before release to focus resources, now reads less like prudent project management and more like an early recognition that the ship was listing. In short, the modern audience, that elusive, oft-invoked beast, declined to show up in sufficient numbers to sustain the narrative that this was the future of gaming. Post-launch, Sedleo did the decent thing and issued a statement. "We've been following your feedback and reviews closely," it began, with the humility of a knight caught napping on watch. Promises of patches for critical bugs and performance tweaks followed, alongside thanks to those who had bothered to play. One wonders whether the tiny project remark was intended as self-deprecation or a subtle reminder that expectations should have been tempered. Either way, it landed with the grace of a halberd to the foot. Patches are forthcoming, we are assured, though whether they can salvage a narrative that some found tropey, plot-hole-ridden, and curiously lacking in character depth remains to be seen. Ida's arc, by several accounts, meanders from plucky determination to vague melancholy without much in the way of revelation. Bianca's role, while central, leaves certain players pondering the mechanics of her rise from postulant to pivotal figure. Female friendship, or something more, is wasted, lament the disappointed. And so the controversy simmers on, a fortnight after release and showing no signs of abating. Steam discussions hum with postmortems, YouTube channels dissect the flop in exhaustive detail, and the culture warriors on both flanks continue their ritual jousting. One faction declares victory for the free market's rejection of agenda-driven slop, the other tuts at toxic masculinity and review bombing as the true villains. The developers, one suspects, simply wish everyone would stop shouting and let them patch the bloody thing. Meanwhile, the Italian Ministry of Culture presumably continues dispersing grants with the serene detachment of a cardinal observing a particularly rowdy tournament. What, then, is one to make of this medieval muddle? 1348 Ex Voto is neither the woke apocalypse its detractors feared nor the triumphant representation its supporters craved. It is, rather more prosaically, a modest indie effort that overreached in ambition while under-delivering in polish, then had the misfortune to wander into the crossfire of the era's favorite pastime, performative outrage. In an age where every sword swing carries symbolic weight, the game's greatest sin may simply be its mediocrity, a reminder that no amount of grants, voice acting, or earnest subtext can compensate for clunky combat and a story that fails to ignite. Yet there is a certain schadenfreude in the spectacle. Here we have a small studio, funded in part by the state, attempting to marry historical grit with personal drama, only to discover that audiences, modern or otherwise, still expect a game that plays well and entertains without hectoring. The irony that the very representation decried as excessive proved insufficient for its intended champions adds a pleasingly farcical coda. One almost expects the next patch notes to include an option for more lesbians, fewer bugs, or perhaps a disclaimer that no Italian taxpayers were harmed in the making of this romance. For now, 1348 Ex Voto lingers in the Steam library like a faded tapestry, handsome in places, threadbare in others, and destined to be remembered less for its nights than for the storm that accompanied them. In the annals of gaming controversy, it earns a footnote, not as a watershed moment, but as a wry illustration of how even the Black Death era cannot escape the plague of modern discourse. Should the updates arrive and redeem the experience, one might yet raise a tankard in reluctant toast. Until then, the moat remains full, the idiot still splashing, and the rest of us, dryly amused, await the next inevitable skirmish. This is your humble servant the Nerd Reaper, and I put the grim gaming takes in the bag.